statement, I'm not your secretary. As you can see, it is interpreted metaphorically a lot more often than the affirmative counterpart. So the negative statement is a lot more metaphoric than the negative counterpart, which is primarily literal. Well, the statement, I'm not your mom, in English, is more metaphoric than its literal counterpart. This is actually what we were trying to show, which is primarily literal, even though in English, the negative statement is not primarily metaphoric, but it's more metaphoric than its affirmative counterpart. So in order to, find out whether this is universal or not, we looked at Hebrew. And in Hebrew, I'm not your mom is primarily metaphoric and obviously more metaphoric than the affirmative counterpart, which is primarily literal. What about you're not my mom? In English, you're not my mom is more metaphoric than its affirmative counterpart, even though it's not primarily metaphoric. Both utterances are primarily literal. Well, probably in English there are no Jewish moms, right? Okay, so the summary of these results in English show that the utterances that we looked at support the prediction that the negative utterances will be always more metaphoric than their affirmative counterparts. And you see the red bars are much longer than the blue bars. Okay, let's move on to Russian data. Looks like Russian, I think that Russians are more like the regular Jew. So the negative items, so okay, I'm not a secretary, is more metaphoric in the negative version than in the affirmative version, which is primarily literal. I'm not your chauffeur is more metaphoric in the negative utterance than in the negative version than in the affirmative version, which is primarily literal. He's not my son is more metaphoric in the negative version than in the affirmative version, which is primarily literal. You're not my mom is more metaphoric. Moms fare rather well even in Russia, which is more metaphoric in the negative version than in the affirmative version, even though both are not primarily metaphoric. Okay, this is not my body is more metaphoric in the negative version than in the affirmative version, which is primarily literal. This is not food is more metaphoric in the negative version than in the affirmative version, which is primarily literal. And this is the overall picture of negative items versus affirmative items in Russian. All the negative utterances are more metaphoric than their affirmative counterparts. German. Okay, this is not a game. It's more metaphoric in the negative version than in the affirmative version, which is primarily literal. And you're not my mom is more metaphoric in the negative version than in affirmative version, which is primarily literal. Okay. These three utterances, again, support the view that negative items tend to induce non-literal interpretations. Okay, now let's go, let's look at the second part of the corpus-assisted study. This time, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at negative utterances. Sorry, I was just reading the next slide. Okay, so this is just the summary. Okay, here we are. Okay, so now we are looking at negative utterances, and we will be studying resonance. Now, resonance is John Dubois' notion. It has to do with how an utterance resonates with the other utterances in the context. And we will be looking at how the context resonates with the target utterances. So we will predict okay, so we will look at contextual resonance with the metaphoric and the literal interpretations of negative statements, and we will predict that contextual environment of the negative statements will resonate with the metaphoric interpretation rather than with the literal interpretation. You give me a chance, you know, to compete with last night's show. Okay, we are looking at